The game you think you're playing doesn't exist. You think you're playing poker. You're wrong. What you're actually playing is a decision-making game under pressure, with incomplete information, against opponents who are also making bad decisions. Inside a variant system that rewards and punishes, regardless of the quality of your logic in the short term. That's not poker, that's life. And almost nobody realizes that the rules governing a Texas Hold'em tournament table are exactly the same rules that have governed empires, financial markets, and military battles throughout all of human history. Charlie Munger spent 70 years building one of the greatest fortunes in the world using a single principle. He called it a latticework of mental models, a network of mental frameworks drawn from physics, biology, psychology, history, mathematics, and philosophy, all interconnected, which when activated together produce a quality of thought that no single discipline can generate alone. Munger said that most people are experts in one thing and idiots in everything else, and that sectoral idiocy is exactly what destroys them in the decisions that matter most. Now apply that to poker. Most players study only poker. Ranges, solvers, GTO, exploitative adjustments, everything inside the same box. And when they arrive at a situation that requires understanding human psychology, game theory, emotional control, or complex systems management, they go blind, because they never built the network. This guide is that network. What you're going to receive in the next parts is not a conventional poker lesson. It is the fusion of the 10 most powerful bodies of knowledge the human mind has ever produced, applied with surgical precision to every inch of your journey as a tournament player. From the first level to the final table. From the moment you sit down to the moment you sign the prize voucher, each part will open an angle you have never seen. Every concept here was tested not in study rooms but in wars, in empires, in the greatest financial markets in history, and at the hardest poker tables in the world. And they all point to the same devastating conclusion. The problem was never your game. It was the thinking structure you used to play it. The question that will change everything for you is simple. If the principles that govern war, markets, and empires are the same ones that govern poker, why are you studying only poker? The answer to that question is the beginning of your transformation. Part 2. The Compound Interest of Competence. Why small edges destroy the field. There is a force that Albert Einstein reportedly called the greatest mathematical discovery in human history. Warren Buffett used it to build a fortune of over $100 billion. And it is exactly this force that separates the players who get rich at poker from the players who spend years stuck in the same place. Compound interest. We are not talking about money. We are talking about competence. Imagine 2 players. The first improves 1% per week for 1 year. The second stays flat. At the end of 52 weeks, the player who improved 1% per week is not 52% better. He is 168% better. Because the improvement of week 2 applies on top of the improved base of week 1. And so on, infinitely, in exponential effect. That is compound interest applied to knowledge. But here is what nobody talks about when it comes to poker. The compound interest of competence only works if you eliminate the zeros. There is a mental model called multiplication by zero. Any number multiplied by 0 is 0. In poker, the zeros are the leaks that cancel out all accumulated progress. A player who improved 168% in ranges and bet sizing, but still goes into severe tilt after 2 outer bad beats has 0 compounding. Because tilt multiplies everything by 0. The best tournament players in the world are not the ones who study the most. They are the ones who eliminated their zeros first, and then let the compound interest of competence work on a foundation with no holes. Here is the practical application. Every week you need to do 2 things. The first is to add a small gain in competence. The second, more important, is to identify and close 1 zero. An emotional leak, a fold situation you are still getting wrong, a pattern of overplaying in certain blind structures. Every 0 closed is a multiplier that holds. Every 0 left open is a multiplier that destroys. Phil Ivey won 10 WSOP bracelets not because he is a supernatural genius, but because for decades he applied compound competence on a foundation that was almost entirely free of fundamental zeros. The difference between him and you is not talent. It is the time of consistent application on a structure with no fundamental holes. Start today. What is your current 0? Part 3. First principles. How to destroy what you know to rebuild what actually works. In 384 BC, Aristotle formulated the most powerful principle in the history of human thought. He called it arche, the fundamental principle from which everything else derives, the premise that cannot be questioned because it is the foundation of everything else. And then he said something devastating. Most human errors do not occur from lack of intelligence. They occur because people start from false premises that were never questioned. 2 millennia later, Elon Musk used exactly that principle to reduce the cost of a rocket by 90%. He did not ask how to build a cheaper rocket. He asked what a rocket actually is, what it is made of, what the real cost of materials is, and why the assembly cost has to be what it has always been. When he questioned the premises, he found that 95% of the cost was tradition, not necessity. Now apply that to your poker game. Most players learn to play by analogy. They copied what better players do. They watched streams, studied hand reviews, memorized opening ranges. All valid. But none of those methods question the fundamental premises. And the premises are where the biggest mistakes are hiding. First principle of poker that almost nobody questions. The objective is to win chips. Wrong. The objective of a poker tournament is to survive and accumulate chips asymmetrically in relation to risk. Winning chips at the wrong moment destroys tournament equity. This premise error causes players to make unnecessary calls in spots where folding preserves more tournament expected value than pot odds suggest. Second unquestioned principle. Bluffing is deceiving your opponent. Wrong. Bluffing is communicating to your opponent information about your range distribution that makes calling unprofitable for them over the long run. It is not about deception. It is about frequency mathematics. When you understand the real principle, every bluff stops being a shot in the dark and becomes the calculated execution of an equilibrium strategy. The most powerful exercise you can do today is to take the 10 things you believe about poker and ask for each one. Is this true because I tested it, or because someone told me and I accepted it? The answers will destroy parts of your game. And then you can rebuild on real foundations. That is first principles thinking, and it is the only way to create a game that is genuinely yours, not a deteriorated copy of someone else's. Part 4. Stoicism and the only real control you have at the table. Epictetus was a slave. He was born without freedom, without property, without rights, and he became the philosopher most quoted by Roman emperors, generals, and statesmen for 500 years. The central principle of everything he taught fits in one sentence. There are things that are under your control and things that are not. Wisdom begins when you learn the difference. Now sit down at a tournament table and apply that. Outside your control, the cards you will receive, the cards that will fall on the board, your opponent's decisions, the bad beats, the coolers, the position you will draw at the next level, whether the fish on your left will call or not. Absolutely none of this is under your control, and most players spend 80% of their mental energy worrying about exactly these things. Under your control, the quality of every decision you make, the emotional state you bring to each hand, the speed at which you process information between hands, how much you rest before a tournament day, how much you studied, how well you sleep, how you handle the rebuy, how you define your emotional stop-loss for a session. Here is the most powerful Stoic insight for tournament poker. When you suffer a severe bad beat, what happens in your prefrontal cortex is measurable. Your probability evaluation capacity drops by an average of 23% over the next 20 hands. This was documented in behavioral neuroscience research. It is not a character weakness, it is physiology. The question is not how to avoid the effect. It is how to have a system to recognize it and neutralize it. The Stoics called this premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Before sitting in any tournament, you visualize the worst possible scenarios. The bad beat on the bubble, the cooler when you are building your stack, the sequence of dead cards at the highest level. You live through these situations mentally before they happen, and when they do happen, your nervous system recognizes them not as catastrophe, but as something you have already processed. Marcus Aurelius governed the greatest empire in human history for 20 consecutive years of war, epidemic, and betrayal, and never lost clarity of decision. He used this technique every morning. You can use it before every tournament. The player who controls only what can be controlled has an edge that no solver can quantify. The collection 2 ebooks have an entire chapter dedicated to building this emotional control system with practical protocols tested in real gameplay. You will find the link in the pinned comment. $29.89 for the complete system. It is not a product. It is the infrastructure that is missing from your game. First year, Part 5, Game Theory, the mathematics the best players use and everyone else ignores. In 1950, John Nash proved mathematically something that forever changed economic theory, military strategy, and any context of competitive decision-making with multiple agents. The Nash equilibrium is the point at which no player benefits from unilaterally changing their strategy, given that the other players maintain theirs. It is the point of maximum strategic resistance, and it is exactly what GTO in poker attempts to approximate. But here is what almost nobody understands about game theory and poker. Nash proved that equilibrium exists, but he also proved that achieving perfect equilibrium in complex games with asymmetric information is mathematically impossible in practice, which means that pure GTO is never playable by a human being in real time. There is always a deviation, and the real money in poker is not in equilibrium. It is in exploiting those deviations. The application of game theory to tournament poker is a constant dance between two positions. The first is equilibrium strategy, which ensures you cannot be exploited when the opponent is unknown or competent. The second is exploitative strategy, which maximizes expected value when you have identified a repeatable pattern in your opponent. The most expensive mistake the GTO generation makes is staying at equilibrium against opponents who are screaming their deviations. A player who makes continuation bets on 95% of hands is asking to be exploited with more frequent check raises. A player who never 3-bets out of position is conceding equity every time you open from the hijack. Game theory does not say to be GTO. It says to identify the equilibrium, find where the opponent deviates, and exploit that deviation until they adjust. And here is where game theory connects with the compound interest of knowledge. Every opponent you study, every pattern you map, every deviation you document, gets deposited into your exploitative knowledge base. Over time, that database compounds. A player with 10 years of attentive play has a repository of human patterns that no solver will capture. Because solvers study ranges, you study human beings. Game theory gives you the mathematics. Compound interest gives you the foundation. Real wisdom lives at the intersection of both. Part 6. Neuroplasticity, how to rewrite the code of the player. You were until 1990, neuroscience believed that the adult brain was structurally fixed, that habits formed in childhood and adolescence permanently defined patterns of emotional response, decision-making, and risk processing, that a player would always be tilt-prone, that a passive player would always tend toward passivity. That belief was wrong. The discovery of neuroplasticity changed everything. The adult brain reorganizes its connections in response to repeated experience. New neural pathways form. Old patterns weaken when they are not activated. Behaviors that seemed permanently installed can be replaced by new behaviors, as long as the substitution process is intentional, repeated, and associated with emotional reward. Applied to poker, this means something profound. The tilt you experience is not who you are. It is a neural circuit that was reinforced by years of automatic emotional response to losses. Every time you went on tilt and kept playing, you reinforced the circuit. Every time you went on tilt and stopped, sat in silence, breathed, and came back with clarity, you began to weaken the old circuit and build a new one. This takes time, but it takes less time than you think. Behavioral neuroscience research shows that a new emotional response circuit stabilizes after 66 consistent repetitions in a low-stress activation context. In a high-activation context, such as high-stakes situations in tournaments, the process requires a specific protocol that combines autonomic regulation, cognitive reframing, and deliberate repetition. The protocol works like this. When you feel the first physiological signals of tilt, increased heart rate, chest tension, racing thoughts, you do not resist. You label it. Research from the University of California shows that labeling an emotion reduces amygdala activity by up to 50%. You say internally, I am feeling frustration. My evaluation system is temporarily compromised. I will wait 3 hands before entering any pot. This is not meditation. It is behavioral neurosurgery that you perform in real time at the table. With 66 repetitions of this protocol, the old tilt circuit loses strength. With 132, it begins to be replaced. With 260, you will have rewritten the code of the player you were. Part 7. The Bias Map. How to use the errors of the human mind to your advantage. Daniel Kahneman spent 40 years researching a single phenomenon and won the Nobel Prize in economics for it. Human beings make systematic and predictable errors, not random ones, systematic ones. The same mistakes, repeated by the same types of people, under the same conditions, infinitely. He called this heuristics and biases. For a tournament player who understands this map, every opponent announces their errors before they even act. The first bias you need to know is loss aversion. Kahneman proved that the pain of losing something is neurologically twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining the equivalent. This means that opponents in loss avoidance mode make defensive decisions that do not maximize expected value. They give up on draws prematurely. They overfold in clear bluff spots. They call with mediocre hands to avoid the pain of folding. How do you exploit this? By increasing your bluffing frequency in situations where the board favors your perceived range and the opponent has demonstrated loss aversion behavior. The mathematics here is not about whether he will fold. It is about systematically exploiting a predictable pattern. The second critical bias is the anchoring effect. The first piece of information received in any decision context anchors all subsequent evaluations. In poker, the previous bet anchors the assessment of pot size for the next decision. An opponent who saw a 30% pot bet on the flop will evaluate a 75% bet on the turn as large, regardless of the actual pot. You can use this to create bet-sizing narratives that appear consistent but are strategically asymmetric. The third bias is confirmation bias. People seek information that confirms what they already believe. A player who has decided you are tight will continue reading you as tight even after you have opened your game. The image you create in the first orbits of a tournament compounds over the entire session. An early shown bluff, strategically displayed, can generate paid-off dividends for hundreds of hands. But here is what most people ignore. You also suffer from every one of these biases. The superior player is not the one who eliminates them. It is the one who knows them, builds systems to compensate for them, and uses them as weapons against those who do not. The bias map is the map of the human battlefield. Whoever has the map wins. Part 8. Complex systems. Why tournaments are living organisms and how to navigate them. In 1972, mathematician Edward Lorenz presented a paper that forever changed the scientific understanding of predictability. The title was, Predictability. Does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? The answer was yes. In complex systems, small initial variations amplify into massive effects that are impossible to predict with precision. A Texas Hold'em poker tournament is exactly that kind of system. The stack position you hold 2 hours into a tournament is not the consequence of one decision. It is the emergence of dozens of small interactions between ranges, positions, bet sizes, reads, emotional states, and random events, all feeding back into loops that amplify. This is what mathematicians call a complex adaptive system. And here is the insight that changes how you play. In complex systems, there is no perfect management. There is state management. Instead of trying to control the system, you manage the state you and the system are in at each moment. The question is not how to win chips in this hand. It is how to keep your personal decision system operating at maximum level while the tournament unfolds around you. Players who understand complex systems do 3 things differently. First, they never evaluate a decision by its outcome. Outcomes in complex systems are affected by variables you do not control. You evaluate by the quality of the decision process. A correct fold that would have been good is not a bad fold. A bad call that got paid off is not a good call. Second, they monitor feedback loops. In the tournament, the image you project generates bets from opponents, which generate your responses, which generate reads from opponents, which generate new bets. That loop feeds back on itself. The player who understands the loop can interrupt it or accelerate it intentionally. A shown bluff is not just a loss. It is an intervention in the feedback loop that will pay dividends for the next 50 hands. Third, they respect emergence. Sometimes the tournament produces conditions that no strategy anticipated. The table dynamic shifts. A short stack enters push or fold mode exactly when you need fold equity. The fish busts and a reg sits to your left. In complex systems, adaptability outperforms predefined strategy. Players who cling to the plan when the system has changed are the first to bust. Poker is not chess, it is an ecosystem. And you are not a piece on the board. You are an organism inside the ecosystem, adapting in real time. Dunmurrow. Part 9. The Pareto Law and the Superior Players System, where your 20% actually lives. In 1896, Vilfredo Pareto was studying the distribution of peas in his garden when he noticed that 20% of the pods contained 80% of the peas. He then applied the same principle to the distribution of wealth in Italy and found the same pattern. 20% of the population owned 80% of the land. He then looked at other systems: business, war, science, art. The same pattern everywhere. 80% of results come from 20% of causes. Now apply that to your tournament poker with surgical precision. 20% of the situations you face in a tournament generate 80% of your final result. Identifying exactly which those situations are and mastering them completely is more valuable than being competent at everything. Let's map those 20%. The first critical cluster is reshove situations with a short stack between 10 and 20 big blinds. In that window, the frequency and precision of your push decisions determine whether you bust before the money or accumulate enough chips to make a deep run. The ICM mathematics in that window is complex and most players improvise. Those who master it have a massive edge. The second cluster is 3-bet spots in position against frequent aggressors. In modern tournaments, the player who does not 3-bet in position is being passively exploited. Every orbit you complete without 3-betting the aggressor to your right is equity given away for free. The third cluster, and the most ignored, is emotional state management in the first 30 minutes after a significant bad beat. Research shows that this is exactly the window in which the greatest chip leaks occur. Not because the player makes one catastrophically bad decision, but because they make dozens of slightly bad decisions in sequence, each individually defensible, but collectively devastating. Now the application of Pareto's law to study. 80% of the time you spend studying poker is probably being spent on the 80% of situations that generate only 20% of your results. You are studying interesting spots, not critical spots. The transformation begins when you invert that. Identify the 20% of spots that determine 80% of your results, and dedicate 80% of your study time exclusively to those spots. That is superior level efficiency. It is not about studying more. It is about studying what matters. Part 10. The Power of Attention. Closing the System and the Player. You can become William James, the father of American psychology, wrote a sentence in 1890 that took over a century for neuroscience to fully confirm. He wrote, "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. An education that would improve this faculty would be the education par excellence." 136 years later, we are living in the most distracting moment in human history. Notifications, infinite information streams, dopamine fragmented into 30-second micro-rewards. The scarcest resource of the 21st century is not money. It is not intelligence. It is deep, sustained attention. And it is exactly that resource that decides who wins poker tournaments. A 9 to 10 hour Texas Hold'em tournament requires you to maintain decision quality in an environment specifically designed to fragment it. Conversations around you. Phones, dealers changing, the table next to you erupting as a player busts. Cocktails, music. Every one of these elements competes for the same neural processor you need to read timing tells, calculate pot odds with precision, and maintain a coherent image across hundreds of hands. The players who reach final tables are not necessarily the most strategically brilliant. They are consistently the most present. Now let's close the complete system that this guide built. The compound interest of competence accumulates. First principles thinking reveals where you are building on sand. Stoicism gives you control over the only domain that is truly yours. Game theory gives you the mathematics of the battlefield. Neuroplasticity proves that the player you are today is not the player you need to be tomorrow. The bias map gives you the atlas of the human mind under pressure. Understanding complex systems teaches you to navigate rather than control. The Pareto Law frees you from the illusion that more is better and redirects you to what actually matters. And deep attention is the fuel that powers all of it in real time. Alone, each of these systems is powerful. Together, they form something that has no name in the conventional vocabulary of poker. They form a complete player. A player who plays the visible game at the table and the invisible game inside their own mind simultaneously. You made it this far because something in this guide recognized something in you. A desire to be more than average, to understand more deeply, to win not by luck, but by the systematic construction of advantage. The 10 ebooks in Collection 2 are the practical extension of everything presented here. Each book deepens one of the systems in this guide with protocols, exercises, hand analyses, and applied frameworks you can use in your next session. This is not theory. It is the complete system, tested, organized to be used by a real player in real tournaments. The link is in the pinned comment below. $29.89. Not for 10 ebooks, for the system that the players reaching final tables are already using while you are still looking for the answer. And if you made it to the end of this video, you already know you are exactly the kind of person who will use it. Subscribe to the channel. What was delivered here is a sample of what comes every single week. Each video is built with the same depth, the same fusion of science, philosophy, and poker, and the same objective: to transform how you think, not just how you play. Because in the end, the player who wins is not the one with the best hand. It is the one with the best mind. See you in the next class.